It started with a text, just one stupid, out-of-the-blue text from my brother-in-law, Brandon, to my wife, Katie. He asked her to meet him for lunch. "It's important," he said. Katie showed me the message, looking a little puzzled but not overly concerned. "Do you think it's about Julia?" she asked, referring to her sister, Brandon's wife. "Maybe they're having problems, and he wants advice." I couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. Brandon wasn't the type to call for one-on-one chats, let alone with Katie. But at the same time, he'd always been the kind of guy who made himself approachable, kind of the fun uncle in the family. He'd helped us move furniture, showed up with beer at cookouts, played board games with the kids. Nothing had ever seemed off before. "I guess it's possible," I said, shrugging. "Go if you want. Just see what he has to say, and if it's serious, we'll figure it out together." The next morning, as Katie got ready for work, she brought it up again. "It's still weird, isn't it?" she asked, pulling her hair into a messy bun. "Brandon's never asked me for something like this before." "Maybe Julia's going through something," I said. "I wouldn't overthink it. Just hear him out." She nodded, kissed me goodbye, and left for work. By the time lunch rolled around, I was too busy with back-to-back meetings to think about it. But when my phone buzzed at 1:47 p.m. and Katie's name popped up, I knew something was wrong. Her voice was shaking as she told me what had happened. Brandon had arrived at the cafe, looking jittery and out of place. They'd made small talk at first, work, the kids, nothing special. But then, as soon as their food arrived, he dove in. "He told me he's in love with me," Katie said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He said he's loved me for years, since before I married you. He said he's always thought we had some kind of connection, and he couldn't hold it in anymore." I sat there in stunned silence as she recounted every word. Apparently, Brandon had gone on and on, telling her she deserved better, that he'd always admired her laugh, her kindness, the way she carried herself. He said he'd been miserable keeping it all bottled up, and that he thought she felt the same. "I didn't know what to say," Katie continued, her voice cracking. "I told him he was wrong, that I didn't feel anything for him, but he just kept talking, like he'd rehearsed it. I finally just grabbed my bag and left. He tried to stop me, but I walked out. I couldn't even process what I was hearing. Brandon? The guy who'd married into the family 10 years ago? The guy who always made jokes at Thanksgiving and tossed the football with our nephews? He'd been harboring feelings for my wife all this time?" As Katie and I spoke, her phone buzzed again. "It's him," she said, her voice filled with disgust. He was texting her nonstop, apologizing and begging her not to tell Julia. One message read, "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just thought you should know how I feel." Another said, "Please don't tell anyone. It'll destroy everything." By the time Katie got home that evening, her nerves were shot. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her shoulders slumped. "What do we do?" she asked as soon as she walked through the door. "I can't keep this from Julia. She deserves to know." But I understood what she was afraid of. Telling Julia meant detonating a bomb in their marriage, in our entire family dynamic. It wasn't just Brandon and Julia's relationship on the line. It was every family gathering, every holiday, every bond we'd built over the years. But there was no way we could keep this a secret. Brandon had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. That night, Katie and I sat in the living room, both of us too restless to sleep. The weight of what Brandon had done was suffocating. Katie kept checking her phone, as if expecting another text from him. "I should block his number," she muttered, staring at the screen. "You should," I said, leaning forward. "But let's hold on to everything he sent first. We might need it if Julia needs to see it." Katie nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I can't believe he did this," she said, her voice shaking. "I trusted him. We've joked around so many times, at barbecues, family dinners. I never thought he'd twist it into something like this." I felt anger bubbling up, but I didn't want to make things harder for her by blowing up. "This isn't on you," I said. "He took something innocent and turned it into a fantasy. That's his problem, not yours." The next day, Katie was still shaken, but she insisted on going to work. "I need to keep busy," she said. "Sitting here thinking about it is going to drive me crazy." I kissed her goodbye, promising to call if anything happened. Around lunchtime, the call came, only it wasn't from Katie. It was Julia. Her voice was tight, like she was holding back tears. "Hey, can you come over?" she asked. I think I need to talk to you and Katie." My stomach dropped. "What's going on?" She hesitated, and then said, "It's Brandon. He told me something last night, and I don't know what to believe." I hung up and called Katie immediately. "We have to go to Julia's," I said. "Brandon's already trying to spin this. He probably told her some twisted version of the story." Katie sounded panicked. "You don't think he said I?" "I don't know," I said, cutting her off. "But we're not letting him get away with it." When we got to Julia's house, she was waiting for us on the front porch. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Brandon wasn't anywhere in sight. She waved us inside, then shut the door behind us. "I'm sorry to drag you into this," Julia said, sitting down at the kitchen table, "but I don't know what else to do. Brandon told me. He told me Katie made a move on him." Katie froze, her face going pale. "What?" she whispered. Julia continued, her voice trembling. "He said you'd been flirting with him for years. That yesterday at lunch, you tried to start something with him." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's a lie," I said immediately. "Julia, he's lying to you. He confessed to Katie yesterday. He's the one who's been obsessed with her, not the other way around." Katie pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. "Here," she said, handing it to Julia. "Look at these. These are the texts he sent me after lunch." Julia scrolled through the messages, her expression hardening with each one she read. When she got to the voicemail Brandon had left, her hands began to tremble. She played it, listening to him sob and beg Katie to stay quiet. "Oh my God," Julia whispered, setting the phone down, her face twisted with anger and betrayal. "He lied to me. He really thought he could get away with this." As if on cue, the front door opened and Brandon walked in. He froze when he saw us, his eyes darting between Katie and me. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice strained. Julia stood up, her body rigid with fury. "You told me Katie tried to start something with you," she spat. "You lied, Brandon. I've seen the messages. I've heard the voicemail. How could you do this?" Brandon's face crumpled. "Julia, please," he said, his voice breaking. "It's not what you think. I just—" "No," Julia shouted, cutting him off. "You've been lying to me, to everyone. How long has this been going on? How long have you been obsessed with Katie while pretending to be my husband?" Brandon opened his mouth, but no words came out. For once, he had nothing to say. Julia pointed toward the door. "Get out," she said, her voice ice cold. "Pack your things and go. I don't want to see you in this house again." Brandon tried to plead, but Julia was done listening. He finally turned and left, his head hanging low. As soon as the door shut behind him, Julia broke down. Katie rushed to her side, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so sorry," Katie said, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Julia shook her head, wiping her tears. "This isn't your fault," she said. "It's him. He ruined everything. And now I have to figure out what to do next." The three of us sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything pressing down on us. None of us knew what the future would look like, but one thing was clear: things would never be the same. In the days following Brandon's exit, the atmosphere in the family shifted from tense to unbearable. Julia was trying to hold herself together for the kids, but the cracks in her facade were obvious. She barely spoke unless it was necessary, and even then, her voice carried the weight of someone barely keeping it together. Katie and I visited often, helping her with the kids and trying to provide some sense of normalcy. But every time we were there, the air felt heavy, as if Brandon's betrayal lingered in the walls. The kids could sense something was wrong, but they didn't understand the full extent of it yet. "Where's Daddy?" Julia's youngest asked one evening, her big brown eyes filled with confusion. Julia froze, her hand hovering over the plate she was drying. "Daddy's staying somewhere else for now," she said softly. Her voice didn't crack, but I could see how much effort it took to keep it steady. Brandon, meanwhile, wasn't staying silent. He hadn't come back to the house, respecting Julia's demand to leave, but he was bombarding her with messages. Apologies, excuses, pleas for forgiveness. Julia didn't answer any of them, but she read them all. I want to know how deep this lie goes, she told us one evening, sitting on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest. The more she read, the angrier she became. Brandon wasn't just apologizing. He was trying to rewrite the narrative. In one message, he claimed Katie had always been flirty with him, and he'd only confessed his feelings because he thought there was something real between them. In another, he painted himself as the victim, saying he'd been lonely and misunderstood for years. Julia showed us the messages, her hands trembling with rage. "Do you see what he's doing?" she said, her voice rising. "He's trying to make himself look like the good guy. Like I'm the reason he did this." Katie looked at the screen, her jaw tightening. "I can't believe he's still trying to blame me," she said. "How does he not see that this is his fault? I've never given him any reason to think I felt the same way." That night, Julia decided she'd had enough. "I'm going through his stuff," she announced. "I want to know if there's more he's hiding." She went into the office they used to share, pulling open drawers and flipping through files. At first, it was just the usual paperwork, bills, receipts, old-school forms for the kids. But then she opened his laptop. "Let's see if there's anything on here," she said, her voice grim. It took a few tries, but she guessed his password. When the desktop loaded, her face changed. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Look at this." Katie and I moved closer as she opened a folder titled Photos. Inside were hundreds of pictures of family events, holidays, birthdays, barbecues. But as she scrolled, it became clear that many of the photos had one thing in common: Katie. There were pictures of her laughing with the kids, standing by the grill, even candid shots where she wasn't looking at the camera. But it got worse. Near the bottom of the folder were a series of photos from a beach trip we'd taken a few years ago. Katie had worn a swimsuit she rarely felt comfortable in, but it had been a fun trip, and she'd felt relaxed. Brandon had taken dozens of pictures of her in that swimsuit. Close-ups, zoomed-in shots, angles that made it obvious she hadn't known they were being taken. Katie stared at the screen, her face pale. "He's been watching me," she whispered. "All this time, he's been watching me, and I didn't even know." Julia slammed the laptop shut, her expression a mix of fury and disgust. "He's sick," she said. "This isn't just infatuation. This is obsession." We sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just seen. Brandon wasn't just a liar or a cheater. He was something far darker, someone who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Julia looked up at us, her jaw set. "I'm calling my lawyer first thing in the morning," she said. "He's not just losing this marriage. He's losing everything." Katie and I nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Brandon might be gone from the house, but his shadow was still everywhere. The following morning, Julia wasted no time. She forwarded the photos to her lawyer along with the screenshots of Brandon's texts and emails. "I want this on record," she told us. "If he tries to fight for custody or pull any more of his manipulative crap, I want every piece of evidence ready to go." Her lawyer was as horrified as we were, especially after seeing the photos. "This strengthens your case significantly," they said. "We'll push for full custody and file for a restraining order." Julia's resolve was unshakable, but the weight of it all was starting to show. She barely slept, constantly worried about what Brandon might do next. Meanwhile, Brandon started to realize the walls were closing in. His messages became more erratic, shifting between desperate apologies and angry accusations. One email stood out in particular. He wrote to Julia, "I know you're talking to a lawyer. You don't have to do this. We can fix this if you just listen to me. You're blowing everything out of proportion." The sheer audacity of it made Julia laugh bitterly. He thinks I'm blowing this out of proportion? He's the one who's been obsessing over Katie and lying to everyone. But then, a few days later, the emails took a darker turn. Brandon wrote to Katie again from another new account. This time, his tone was angrier, more unhinged. He accused her of ruining his life, claiming that she had led him on and that she owed him for the years he'd spent pining for her. "You think you're so perfect," one email read. "Like you didn't know what you were doing, teasing me all these years." You're just as guilty as I am, Katie. Don't pretend you're innocent. Katie showed me the emails, her hands shaking. What do we do? She asked. He's losing it. We send it to Julia and her lawyer, I said firmly. The more he talks, the more he digs himself deeper. But you block this address too. Katie nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She was beginning to feel like Brandon's obsession would never end. When we forwarded the emails to Julia, she didn't hesitate. I'm adding this to the restraining order, she said. He's not just harassing me, he's harassing you too. Later that week, Julia had her first hearing to address custody and the restraining order. Katie and I went with her for support, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. Brandon looked terrible, disheveled, gaunt, and nothing like the confident, easygoing man we'd once known. When the judge asked him to respond to the allegations, he mumbled something about being misunderstood, claiming he'd never meant to hurt anyone. But the evidence spoke for itself. The photos, the texts, the emails. It painted a clear picture of someone who had crossed every boundary imaginable. The judge granted Julia temporary full custody and issued a restraining order that barred Brandon from contacting her, Katie, or any of us. As we left the courthouse, Julia exhaled deeply, like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. It's not over, she said, her voice firm, but at least now I feel like I can breathe again. Katie and I were relieved too, but the tension hadn't disappeared. Even with the restraining order in place, we couldn't shake the feeling that Brandon wasn't done. That night, Julia called me. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. I went through the rest of his laptop, she said. There's more. My stomach dropped. More photos? No, she said, her tone bitter. Worse. He kept a journal, like a digital diary. It's all about Katie, how he's felt about her, how he convinced himself she loved him back. There are entries where he talks about me too, like I was just in the way of his real happiness. The anger in her voice was palpable, but beneath it was a deep sadness. He was building this fantasy in his head for years, she said, and I didn't even see it. Julia sent me some of the entries, and reading them made my skin crawl. Brandon had written in excruciating detail about family gatherings, interpreting innocent moments as signs of a connection between him and Katie. A shared laugh became proof of mutual affection. A casual hug was, in his mind, an intimate moment. When I showed the entries to Katie, she looked horrified. I feel like I need a shower, she said. How did he get away with this for so long? How did none of us see it? I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that the more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Brandon's obsession was deeper and darker than we'd ever imagined. In the days following the hearing, the restraining order gave us a small sense of relief, but the fallout of Brandon's actions continued to ripple through every corner of our lives. Julia was trying to move forward, but the journal entries she'd found on his laptop stuck with her. It's like he was living in a completely different reality, she said one evening, sitting at her kitchen table while Katie and I helped with the kids. How can you be married to someone for 10 years and not see this side of them? None of us had an answer. Brandon's fixation on Katie, his twisted attempts to justify it, and the way he'd painted himself as a victim. It was all deeply disturbing. Julia had shared the journal entries with her lawyer, who said they further solidified her case for full custody. The judge will see this for what it is, the lawyer had assured her. Obsession and delusion. But even with the legal process moving forward, the emotional toll was enormous. Julia barely slept, jumping at every sound in the house. Katie, too, was on edge, constantly checking over her shoulder when we went out. I know he's not supposed to come near us, she said one evening, but what if he doesn't care? What if the restraining order isn't enough? I hated seeing her like this, nervous, second-guessing everything. It wasn't like her. Katie was usually confident and self-assured, the type of person who could handle anything. But Brandon had shaken her, and I wasn't sure how to help her feel safe again. Then, a week after the hearing, Brandon broke the restraining order. It wasn't dramatic, no surprise visits or confrontations, but it was enough to send a chill through all of us. Katie received an email from another new account. It was short, almost restrained, but the tone was unmistakably manipulative. I know I'm not supposed to contact you, but I just need you to understand. I never meant to hurt you. I still care about you, Katie. I always will. She showed it to me immediately, her hands trembling as she held up her phone. Why is he still doing this? She whispered. Why can't he just leave us alone? We forwarded the email to Julia and her lawyer, who wasted no time filing a report with the court. The judge acted quickly, escalating the restraining order to include harsher penalties for any future violations. Brandon was also summoned for a follow-up hearing to address the breach. He's only making things worse for himself, the lawyer said. The more he violates the order, the stronger your case becomes. Despite this small victory, the tension in our lives was reaching a breaking point. Julia, determined to regain some control, decided to start going through the rest of Brandon's belongings that he'd left behind. I want it all out of my house, she said. Every trace of him gone. Katie and I helped her sort through boxes of clothes, old books, and random knickknacks. At first, it was mundane, just the remnants of a shared life now shattered. But then Julia opened a drawer in their shared office and froze. You're not going to believe this, she said, pulling out a small leather notebook. It was a physical journal, filled with Brandon's cramped handwriting. Flipping through it felt like peeling back the layers of his fractured mind. The entries mirrored the ones on his laptop, but were even more detailed. He wrote about his fantasies of being with Katie, his resentment toward me, and his frustration with Julia for standing in the way of what he believed was his destiny. One entry stood out. It described a moment during a family barbecue months earlier. Brandon had written, "She looked at me across the table, and I knew she felt it too. The connection. The way she smiled. It was meant for me, not him. I just need her to admit it. Once she does, everything will fall into place." Katie read the passage and recoiled, as if the notebook had burned her. "He's completely delusional," she said, her voice thick with disgust. "I didn't even notice him at that barbecue. I was probably smiling at the kids or something. How could he turn that into this?" Julia's face was pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He's been sitting at our family gatherings, watching us, writing this stuff," she said quietly. "How did I miss it? How did I not see how sick he was?" The discovery of the journal deepened our sense of unease. Brandon wasn't just obsessed. He'd been building a distorted narrative in his head for years, twisting every interaction to fit his delusions. It was unsettling to think about how many moments we'd shared as a family, completely unaware of what was going on in his mind. We packed up the journal and added it to the growing pile of evidence. Julia handed it off to her lawyer, who promised to use it in the custody proceedings. "This is more than enough to show the court that he's unfit," the lawyer said. "We'll make sure he's held accountable." As we left Julia's house that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Brandon was out of the picture physically, but his shadow loomed large. Katie clung to my arm as we walked to the car, her eyes scanning the dark street. "Do you think he'll ever stop?" she asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer. Brandon's actions had already gone far beyond anything we could have imagined. All I could do was hold her close and promise, "We'll make sure he never hurts you, or anyone else again." But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Brandon's continued presence in our lives, even from a distance, was exhausting. Julia's lawyer was confident about the custody battle, but every step forward felt overshadowed by the constant dread of what he might do next. The journal, the emails, the photos, everything painted a picture of a man who wasn't just desperate but unstable. It was hard to feel like we were making progress when his obsession still hung over us. Then, another letter arrived. Not an email this time, but a handwritten letter delivered to Julia's mailbox. She called us immediately, her voice shaking. "It's from him," she said. "I haven't opened it yet. Can you come over?" Katie and I drove over, a sense of foreboding filling the car. Julia was sitting at her kitchen table, the unopened envelope in front of her. It was addressed to her in Brandon's handwriting. "What do I even do with this?" she asked, staring at it like it might explode. "We add it to the pile," I said firmly. "It's more evidence for your case. Whatever's in there, it's just him trying to manipulate you." She nodded, then opened the letter with trembling hands. The contents were exactly what we expected. a mix of desperate apologies and veiled accusations. He wrote about how much he loved their kids, how he couldn't understand why she was turning them against him. He begged for another chance, but also tried to shift blame, saying she'd overreacted, and that he only ever wanted to be honest. But then, at the end of the letter, he took a darker turn. He mentioned Katie again, saying, "You know, I only ever wanted what was best for all of us. Katie understood me in a way you never did. She's the reason I couldn't pretend anymore." Julia slammed the letter down on the table, her face twisting in anger. "He's still trying to blame her," she said through gritted teeth. "Still trying to drag her into this, like it's her fault." Katie was pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "He's never going to stop, is he?" "We're not going to let him win," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Every time he does something like this, it only proves our case more. He's digging his own grave." We forwarded the letter to Julia's lawyer, who immediately filed another report with the court. The restraining order was expanded again, and the judge warned Brandon that further violations would result in serious consequences. Still, it didn't feel like enough. Every time we thought we'd taken control, Brandon found another way to remind us that he was still out there. A few days later, Katie received another email. This one was short but chilling. "If I can't have peace, neither can you," it read. There was no apology, no attempt to explain, just a single sentence that sent shivers down our spines. We reported it immediately, and the police got involved. Brandon was officially warned that any further contact would result in criminal charges. It was the first time the situation felt like it was being taken seriously beyond the family and legal circles. Still, the damage had already been done. Katie was scared to leave the house alone, and Julia started looking into moving, hoping a fresh start would help her and the kids feel safe again. The next big step was the custody hearing. Julia's lawyer was relentless, presenting every piece of evidence. The photos, the journals, the emails, the violations of the restraining order. Brandon's lawyer barely mounted a defense, and Brandon himself looked defeated, like he already knew how it would end. The judge ruled in Julia's favor, granting her full custody of the kids and restricting Brandon to supervised visitation only after a full psychological evaluation. When the hearing ended, Julia broke down in tears, not out of sadness, but out of relief. "It's over," she said, clutching Katie's hand. "At least for now, it's over." But even with the legal battle behind us, the emotional scars were harder to heal. Julia's kids, though young, could sense the tension that had filled their lives for months. Katie, too, was still struggling to move past what had happened. "I feel like I'll never be able to trust anyone again," she admitted one night. "How do you know who's safe and who's not when someone like Brandon can fool you for years?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. The truth was, Brandon had shaken all of us in ways we hadn't even fully realized yet. His obsession had fractured not just his own life, but ours too, leaving behind a mess that would take a long time to clean up. As for Brandon, he disappeared from our lives entirely after the hearing. He moved out of town, cut off from everyone except for his court-appointed supervisor. We didn't know where he went, and we didn't care, as long as he stayed away. But even with him gone, his shadow lingered. It would take time for all of us to feel normal again, if that was even possible. For a while, things finally seemed to settle. Brandon was out of the picture, Julia had full custody of the kids, and the restraining order held strong. But the wounds he left behind were still raw. Julia threw herself into rebuilding her life. New routines, therapy for the kids, and plans to move out of the house she'd shared with him. "I don't want this place to feel like it belongs to him anymore," she told me one night. "I want a fresh start for all of us." Katie and I were trying to move forward too, but Brandon's obsession had left its mark. Katie struggled with lingering guilt, replaying every interaction with him in her head. "I keep wondering if I missed something," she confessed one evening. "If I should have seen the signs earlier." "You didn't miss anything," I told her. "He hid this from everyone. He twisted innocent moments into something they weren't. That's on him, not you." Still, the fear of what Brandon might do next lingered like a dark cloud. We all knew he was unpredictable, and even though he'd been quiet since the custody hearing, it was hard to believe he was truly gone for good. Then, one night, the quiet broke. It was late, almost midnight, when Katie's phone buzzed. She groaned, half asleep, and reached for it on the nightstand. But when she saw the screen, her eyes went wide. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. The message was short but unsettling. "I need to see you. I'll be outside." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. "What the hell does he mean, outside?" I whispered, already moving to check the windows. Katie followed, clutching her phone tightly. Pulling back the curtain in the living room, I scanned the street. It was dark, quiet, and empty. For a moment, I thought it might have been a bluff, a sick attempt to scare us. But then I saw it. A shadowed figure leaning against a car at the far end of the street. "It's him," I said, my voice low. "Stay here. Call the police." "Wait, you're not going out there," Katie began, but I was already at the door. I stepped outside, adrenaline pumping, and walked to the edge of the driveway. Brandon didn't move, just stood there, his hands shoved in his pockets. When I was close enough, I could see his face. He looked pale, hollow, like a man who had completely unraveled. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" I demanded. "I just want to talk," he said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "Please, I need to explain." "There's nothing to explain," I snapped. "You've destroyed your family, harassed my wife, and ignored the restraining order. You're done, Brandon." He took a step forward, and I raised my hand to stop him. "Don't," I said firmly. "The police are on their way. Leave now, or you'll be leaving in handcuffs." For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he slumped back against his car. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he muttered. I loved her. I still do." I couldn't believe the audacity. "She never loved you, Brandon," I said coldly. "You made all of this up in your head. And now, because of your obsession, you've lost everything. That's on you." He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of sirens cut through the silence. 2 patrol cars turned onto the street, their lights flashing. Brandon didn't resist when the officers approached him. He just stood there, defeated, as they cuffed him and led him to one of the cars. Katie was standing on the porch when I came back inside, her face pale but resolute. "Is he gone?" she asked. "For good this time," I said, pulling her into a hug. The officers told us later that Brandon had violated his restraining order for the last time. He was facing serious charges and wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. Julia was relieved when we called her, but the exhaustion in her voice was clear. "I just want this to be over," she said. "I want to stop looking over my shoulder." In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal. Julia finalized her divorce and found a new home, one that felt like hers alone. Katie started to regain her confidence, though it took time. And as for Brandon, the legal system finally did what we couldn't. It removed him from our lives entirely. Looking back, it was hard to believe how much damage one person could cause. Brandon's obsession had nearly torn us all apart, but in the end, he only destroyed himself. It wasn't easy, and the scars he left will always be there, but we're healing. Slowly but surely, we're learning to move forward without him.